Welcome to my second video talking about why are people getting so worked up over Israel. Tonight I'll be talking primarily about the Palestinian point of view and also why many pro-Israeli and pro-Zionist people uh, equate being anti-Israel to being anti-Semitic. So what about these Palestinian Arabs? Well, in 1800, they were the overwhelming majority in the area and had been so for nearly 1,000 years. It's only human nature for them to consider it their land. For them, their history from 1800 on was a series of betrayals and catastrophically bad decisions. In the 1800s, Palestine was still part of the Ottoman Empire. At that time, the Ottomans were really only a step or two away from feudalism. Most of the land in Palestine was owned by absentee landlords in huge tracts. The majority of Palestinian Arabs worked on that land as tenant farmers. The British Empire and the Ottoman Empire made an agreement to allow European Jewish settlers to come to Palestine and purchase the land if they so desired. The Jewish settlers arrived with great deals of cash from international organizations that were backing the settlement movement. The Arab tenant farmers were always at a disadvantage. They were never in a position to be able to buy the land that they were working on. And when the Jewish settlers purchased the land, they had to go elsewhere to work because the Jews were planning on working the land themselves. For them, their own government appeared to be favoring foreigners over them. Worse than that, foreigners of a different faith. When World War One was completed and the Middle East was severed from the Ottoman Empire, the next great betrayal occurred. In Iraq, a mandate was created to transition the area from a British colony to an Arab-run state. Similar mandates were set up in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. All the mandates were to be set up uh, as British colonies that would transition to fully run Arab governments, one exception being Palestine. Palestine was to be the home of a new Jewish state, not necessarily the entirety of Palestine. And at the time, they weren't exactly sure how it was going to be set up, other than there was going to be a Jewish state somewhere within the confines of Palestine. The Palestinian Arabs felt left out of this promise of nationhood that the other Arab states are being offered, a promise that was not being offered to them. When the end of the UN mandate happened and the British pulled out of Palestine, the Palestinian Arabs had to decide whether they were going to accept the UN mandate or not. They didn't. The decision to not accept the mandate came from both the leadership of the Palestinian Arabs as well as the leadership of the surrounding Arab states. Palestinians were assured that the combined might of the Middle East Arabs should very easily be able to excise the Jewish interlopers from their midst. Now, if you think about it from the Palestinian point of view at this point, okay, uh, the whole movement of Jewish settlers was maybe about 100 years old at this point, whereas they had roots going back much further. So, in their mind, the idea of accepting an agreement that splits up Palestine into parts was a loss for them. In their mind, it should have all been theirs. So, it was a natural decision for them to make to say, uh, clearly, especially if we know we're going to win, uh, we should not accept the agreement. Obviously, in hindsight, considering how the war turned out, this turned out to be a catastrophically bad decision. Once the war kicked off, the Arab leadership told the Palestinian people that the wisest course of action was to flee their land and head for the borders. This too turned out to be a catastrophic decision. Uh, the Arabs that stayed behind, a lot of them got to keep their land. Almost all the Arabs who fled lost their land to incoming Jewish refugees. And obviously, this is if you look at prior to the end of the mandate, all the land owned by Jewish people in Israel was purchased legitimately. In this case, the land was expropriated. And very much you can understand why the Palestinians would be unhappy about the expropriation. As a result of the end of the first 1948 war, Egypt ends up occupying the Gaza Strip, and Jordan ends up occupying the West Bank. Jordan would eventually annex the West Bank, basically saying it is now part of all Jordan. And they never set up any kind of timeline or framework to create a self governing Palestinian state there. Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip, and although they gave the appearance of setting up a self governing state, uh, that state was never really truly put into place or practice. Egypt would pretty much run it as an occupied zone for their entire tenure there. When Egypt and Israel would later negotiate at the Camp David Accords in the late 70s, Egypt would negotiate for the creation of an autonomous region within Gaza on behalf of the Palestinians, and ultimately would end up being the Israelis who manifested the autonomous state of Gaza. Then, the ultimate betrayal to the Palestinians was they found themselves unwelcome in any of the lands they ended up in. To this day, the grandchildren of those Palestinians exist in refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Israel. These countries do not want them as permanent citizens, and during the negotiations when the Gaza Strip was being discussed, Israel actually offered to give it back to Egypt to take care of, and the Egyptians wanted nothing to do with it. Uh, this rebuke from their fellow Arabs must be very stinging to the Palestinians indeed. Now, getting on to another topic I said we were going to bring up is the idea of um, being anti Israeli is also anti Semitic. Now, this is a difficult concept for people who are not Jewish or who may be Jewish and are not Zionists. It is a concept that being anti Israeli is being anti Semitic or anti Jewish. Can you be anti Israel and pro Jewish? I think the answer is yes. However, I fully understand why many Jewish people and Zionists would say the answer is no. I'm going to use an example in history of pre Civil War United States and slavery. And to be clear, I'm not trying to make a moral equivocation between slavery and the current situation in Israel at all. It's literally, if that's what you're taking from this, then you're completely missing the point. Um, the reason I'm using it is because it's the only example I know from history that fits. That might help you to understand the point of view. So in the South, there are numerous examples of slave uprisings. Pretty much whenever a slave uprising occurred, the slaves would murder their owners and uh, do other things to the female members of those families. Thank you, YouTube. And this was usually done with great brutality. And then, if they were successful in taking over their plantation, they would then start moving on to the closest neighbors and continuing in a murdering spree until they were met with massive force by the local militia and the uprising was put down. Now, in the North, people spoke rather glibly of the slave uprisings. Many of them did not intellectually work through the entirety of the meaning of them. In their minds, the slaves had an uprising and then they were free. They didn't think through the nastier parts of what would happen to the slave owners and other bystanders in the process. So, when John Brown attempted to create a massive slave uprising via the Harper Ferry raid, his goal was to create a slave uprising across the entire South. He knew and expected this to cause mass death amongst white Southerners. So the South was truly appalled by the implications of the plan once he was arrested and all came to light. For many people up north who did not think through the full implications of an uprising like this, touted John Brown as a hero. So the South was horrified. Here's a man whose goal was to essentially kill them all, and up in the north, he was being treated as a hero. They assumed that everybody who lauded John Brown also wanted every last one of them dead. In their minds, the only way slavery ended in the South was at the end of a massive slave uprising with all them dead. If there are any doubts in the minds of the Southerners, the more radical newspapers in the North did what nowadays we would call saying the quiet part out loud. Many editorials in the North recognized that a slave uprising would end up killing most of the white Southerners. And to the most radical abolitionists, the deaths of white Southerners would be a form of justice. For Jews in Israel, there are some similarities. They've experienced terrorism from Palestinians since before the inception of their country. Terrorism is always brutal and indiscriminate, much like a slavery uprising. To the Jews, the only way Israel ceases to exist and becomes free Palestine is via a Palestinian uprising on a much greater scale than what happened in early October of this year. So, when some sign-waving hipster says free Palestine, and Israelis see the piles of dead bodies in order for this to occur, that's the association they make. And just in case you're thinking, well, nobody really means that. Well, just like the pre-Civil War Northern radical newspaper editorialists, we do have American journalists willing to state this nightmarish scenario out loud. I'll quote what Najma Sharif, who is a writer for Soho magazine and Teen Vogue, posted to X. He said, speaking specifically of what happened in Israel when Hamas raided Israel, this is what decolonization looks like. What did you all think decolonization meant? Vibes? Papers? Essays? Losers. So I think this is a good point to end this here. Next time we'll get into a little bit on anti-Semitism because it's a factor. And we'll also get into um, essentially Christian Zionism, why certain sects of Christians are almost as enthusiastic, if not more enthusiastic, about Israel. We'll talk about the Cold War ties, and then we'll probably get into the whole why we have pro-Hamas movements occurring on American colleges. All right, so question for you below if you want to answer it. How is that example of Civil War South versus current day Israel work for you? I know it's a little bit awkward, but again, it was the only one I could think of. Did that help put it into perspective for you? If not, do you have a better idea? I'd love to hear it. Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithm brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, please check out my other titles. I do a lot of different things. Surely you'll find something you like. Consider subscribing. And if you know somebody who find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.